Welcome to a meeting of the Boston Region Metropolitan Planning Organization. My name is David Moeller. I represent Secretary Pollock here. All participants will join the meeting with muted microphones. Please rename yourself to include your first name, your last name, and your affiliation if you have one. If you're an MPO member, please state so. Please do not unmute or mute yourself. We will take care of it. To participate in the discussion, please select the raise hand function. Find this by clicking on the participants button at the bottom of the screen, and a window will pop up with a raise hand button at the bottom. The presenters will then call on the participants and unmute their microphones. If you're on the phone, you can use the *9 to raise your hand. If you have any technical difficulties, please contact Regine Foley via the chat box or at rfoley, F-O-L-E-Y, at ctps.org or at 857-702-3704. This meeting is accessible to people with disabilities. Zoom products are compliant, with exceptions, with the following standards: Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 Level AA standards and revised Section 508 standards. If you require any additional accommodations in order to participate fully in this meeting, please contact Regine Foley of the MPO staff at rfoley, F-O-L-E-Y, at ctps.org or call her at 857-702-3704. Jonathan, can you please call the roll?
Yes, sir. MassDOT Chair.
Here.
David Moeller. Okay. MassDOT C2. John Bouchard here. I know he usually attends.
Not seeing him.
Not seeing him. Okay. MassDOT Highway Division.
John Romano here.
Thank you. MBTA.
Samantha Silverberg here.
Thank you. Massport.
Good morning. This is Laura Gilmore with the Massachusetts Port Authority.
Thank you. MAPC.
Hello, this is Eric Barassa with MAPC.
Great. Thank you. MBTA Advisory Board.
Good morning. Brian Kane is here.
Thank you. Regional Transportation Advisory Council.
Leonard Diggins with the Advisory Councils here. Good morning.
Morning. Thank you. City of Boston BTD.
Tom Cads is representing Mayor Martin Walsh, City of Boston. Thank you.
Thank you. City of Boston BPDA. Okay, looks like no Jim Fitzgerald today. At large, City of Everett.
Jay Monty, City of Everett, representing Mayor DeMaria.
Thank you. At large, City of Newton.
David Kozas, representing Mayor Ruth Ann Fuller in the City of Newton.
Great. Thank you. At large, Town of Arlington. Okay. At large, Town of Lexington.
Sheila Page, Town of Lexington, at large member representing Doug Lucente, Lexington Chair, and the member communities.
Wonderful. Thank you. Inner Core Committee, City of Somerville.
Good morning. Tom Bent, City of Somerville, representing Joe Curtatone and the Inner Core.
Great. Thank you. Magic, Town of Acton. Okay. Metro West, City of Framingham.
Pat Chiquiza, representing Mayor Spicer in Metro West.
Thank you. North Shore Task Force, City of Beverly.
Darlene Nguyen, representing Mayor Michael Cahill for the North Shore Task Force.
Thank you. North Suburban Planning Council, City of Woburn. Okay. South Shore Commission, Jennifer, Town of Rockland. Thank you.
Jennifer Constable, Town of Rockland, representing the South Shore Coalition.
Great, thank you. Southwest SWAP, Town of Medway. Okay, and Trick, Town of Norwood.
Good morning, Tom O'Rourke from the town of Norwood, representing the Trick subregion.
Thank you. And our ex officio members, Federal Highway Administration. Okay. Federal Transit Administration. Okay. I believe that calls the roll, Mr. Chair, unless other people have been added. Oh, I see Jim Fitzgerald and John Bouchard have been added. MassDOT C2.
John Bouchard, MassDOT, joined.
Thank you. City of Boston, BPDA.
Hey, everybody. Jim Fitzgerald with BPDA, representing Mayor Walsh, City of Boston. Thanks.
Thank you. That calls the roll, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Jonathan. Next item is the chair's report, and I do not have one, so let's skip ahead to the executive director's report. Tegan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome, everyone. So I'd like to start with an outreach highlight or two, and I did want to highlight that MPO staff recently, in collaboration with MAPC, hosted the Intercore transportation meeting. That was our second one on October 7th. It'll actually be the first of 4 meetings that we plan to hold in FY21. The federal fiscal year 2021. And at that meeting, we did discuss the changes to the TIP criteria, and we also got ideas from the group on future discrete studies. And we discussed present and future regional transportation challenges and possible solutions. So it was a great and robust conversation. And we want to, as MPO staff, want to thank all of the municipalities and the board members who participated in those meetings. The next ones will be on January 13th, April 7th, and July 14th. But you'll see those dates in an email, so please feel free not to track them as I'm saying them. And they'll also be in the MBO calendar. So look for the next one in January, about mid-January. Upcoming, we will also be hosting 2 how-to sessions about the TIP, the 5-year capital investment program at the end of October on a Monday and a Wednesday. And this will be to share information about the TIP process with anybody who's interested in learning. So if you are interested, please do register. There are links on the MPO calendar that you can use to register for those events or reach out to staff if you have any questions. I also wanted to add in a reminder that the MPO elections, that nominations are due to MAPC by tomorrow, October 16th. And then those are my general updates. For today, I do want to comment that we'll be following a less than our usual order. We'll actually be, after a few of these kinds of reports, we'll be starting with a presentation and discussion from the MBTA, and then follow with the requested votes on various work scopes, because one of those work scopes is related to the discussion. So we thought it would be important first for you to hear from the MBTA on their Forging Ahead initiative. This is the initiative they've been discussing with the FMCB. And it is to develop a strategy for service planning and capital planning in anticipation of the budget gap that would be coming for the fiscal year that begins on July 1st, 2021. So we'll have that discussion first, and then we will have 4 work scopes for your review. These are both MPO funded and non-MPO funded. You can see those on the agenda, but just as a reminder, we also like to bring non-MPO funded scopes to the board for your awareness and approval, since MPO staff is working on those scopes. Lastly, I'll just say that at the next meeting, we will likely be discussing the first amendment for federal fiscal year 2021 UPWP. That'll probably include a few adjustments to the discrete studies as we defined them a number of months ago. And the intent is to sort of primarily be sensitive to and reflective of the COVID-19 situation, how that impacts those original study ideas that we had. And then there'll also be some additional scopes for your review, specifically related to Cape Rail, as well as our study to think about what are the most important things to think about in our scenario planning that will happen not too far down the line in preparation for the long-range plan. And then we'll also be talking about the disproportionate impact and disparate burden presentation, the memo and the policy that will follow from the work that's been done recently. And then finally, I believe we will be also talking about the trip generation study, which was where staff looked into innovative approaches to either improving upon or in some cases develop alternatives to the trip generation analysis that uses the ITE trip generation manual. So I know a number of board members were particularly interested in that study, and hopefully we'll be talking about that next time. And that is all I have, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Tegan. Any questions for Tegan? If so, please raise your hand. Seeing and hearing none, the next item on the agenda is public comments. Is there anyone from the public who would like to comment at this time? Please raise your hand or use the *9 key if you would. Seeing none, if you would like to comment during the meeting, please let us know and we will call on you. Next up, Regional Transportation Advisory Council. Lynn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we had a meeting yesterday, and Matt Genova presented to us the give us our final presentation on the TIP criteria revision, and there was some good conversation, and we were also very excited to hear about the redevelopment of the TIP how-to guide, and so that was pretty much the meeting. And there was one other aspect to the meeting that will affect you all, and that is that I was elected to another term, and I am very happy about that. I've really enjoyed the past year, and I wanted to be the chair, and it has been a really wonderful experience, and I'm looking forward to another year. And I thank you all for your patience and guidance, and it's really great working with people who care as much about transportation as much as you all do, and especially with the focus on equity that this organization has always had. And finally, our next meeting is going to be on the 4th. It's going to be a week earlier due to the Veterans Day holiday, and we will have Michael Bachler, I think is how you pronounce his last name. He's from MassDOT. He's going to talk with us about how projects are priced. And so thank you very much.
Thank you, Lynn, and congratulations. On behalf of the MPO, I think I can speak for everybody. We're really glad you're back.
Thank you.
Next item is the action item for the minutes. Can I get a motion and a second to approve the minutes of September 3rd? And please state your name for the record when you make the motion and the second. Eric Barassa.
I will make the motion to approve the minutes.
Brian Kane.
Second, Brian Kane.
Thank you. Motion having been made and seconded. Any comments, questions, suggestions, or changes? Seeing none. Jonathan, please call the roll.
David Moeller,
Yes.
John Bouchard, John Romano. Oh, John Bouchard.
Yes.
Thank you. John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
thank you. Samantha Silverberg,
Yes.
Laura Gilmore,
Yes.
Eric Barassa,
Yes.
Brian Kane,
Yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Yes.
Tom Kadzis,
Yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Sheila Page,
Sheila Page, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Thatcher Keyser,
Thatcher Keyser votes yes.
Darlene Nguyen,
Darlene Nguyen votes yes.
Jennifer Constable,
Jennifer Constable, yes.
And Tom O'Rourke.
Yes.
Motion carries unanimously, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Jonathan. Next item on the agenda is a discussion of the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority prioritization approach for state fiscal year SF 2022 service changes. Both Samantha Silverberg and Laurel Paget-Seekins will be talking to us. So I think Laurel's going first, but I'm not sure, but whenever you're ready.
Yeah, Laurel is going to start the conversation about service, and then I will end the conversation about capital, and then both of us will be available for questions from the MPO board. So Laurel, over to you.
Thank you, Sam. Next slide, please. So I wanted to sort of just give an overview quickly of the process that we're using, that we're calling Forging Ahead. That is the process that we're using to really sort of focus our resources on our services that are currently serving our essential trips. And so we're doing a three-pronged process. One is first evaluating our internal spending on non-service related expenditures to reduce them. The second is the capital work that Sam will be talking about. And the third is really thinking about the service and what service we should be running. And so I'm going to talk through the service side. But the really key main takeaway from this that I want people to get is that we're really trying to address this crisis in a proactive way, where we're really thinking about what is the future that we want to come out of this crisis. And so how can we make sure that we are making decisions now that build that future, and how we're making sure that we're going to be serving the recovery from this crisis. So that is the fundamental principle of Forging Ahead. On the next slide, shows sort of where we are now. So one of the key things to know is that our ridership fell significantly at the beginning of the pandemic and has recovered slowly. Different lines have recovered at different levels. Currently, our highest percent of return is on the bus, the ride, and the blue line, as you can see the top lines in the chart. But essentially, we're currently running approximately the same level of service that we ran last year, but we're carrying 330,000 trips on an average weekday now, as opposed to 1.26 million last September. And so this is really driving our thinking about how to respond. On the next slide, we talk through some of the reasons why we need to change service. Some of it is about making sure that we're accounting for where rider trips are now and making sure that we can accommodate social distancing on those trips. Some of it is understanding the travel patterns have changed and are changing and will continue to change throughout this crisis, and taking that into account, and recognizing that those changes might be more long term, and that we need to account for that in our budgeting, and that we need to focus our resources on where we have the most ridership and where we think their most ridership will continue and will return. And to really prioritize equity in this decision making. And so Forging Ahead is this process we're using to really have this conversation about how we are going to continue to provide the service that our riders and community depend on, and how to prioritize that service. So on the next slide is some of the commitments that we're making to how we're going to do this, and that we're going to continue to prioritize safety, reliability, and accessible transportation, and the needs of the riders who depend on transit the most. And do that in a flexible way, do that in a way of thinking about how we sort of most efficiently and equitably use our resources, how we think about the balance between capital and operating, which is what Sam is going to talk about, making sure that we're thinking about how the economy in the region is going to recover, and acknowledging the uncertainty in the moment and how we can plan for that. But really, and I think this last point is extremely important, making sure that, as I said at the beginning, we're moving forward, that we're not recreating the service that we previously had, that we are being responsive to the crisis and building back the network that we need moving forward. So on the next slide, just want to sort of reiterate that before we start talking about service reductions, we are first doing the internal work on our budget and also doing this work on the capital part that Sam will talk about. So that changes to service is the last thing that we're doing. Then on the next slide, I start to talk about the framework we're using to think about service. And so we've created this framework that really is looking at two dimensions. One is where we're serving transit critical populations, which is defined as in low income, people of color, seniors, people with disabilities, and households with no to low vehicles. And so that is one of the dimensions of our analysis. And the other is where we currently see high ridership, or where we see the propensity for a return to high ridership in the near to immediate future. Since we're talking about changes that would potentially take effect next year. And so the framework we're using is trying to make sure that we maintain a level of service that is consistent with our service delivery policy in the quadrant that is high ridership and high transit critical populations. And within the other quadrants, we are then considering sort of what trade-offs we are comfortable with making on service levels, depending on the characteristics of those quadrants as well as the particular routes. Because within this analysis, which is really designed to compare all of our services to each other, within each of the services, we will actually make very careful, thoughtful thoughts about the differences between bus routes and lines based on ridership, based on demographics, based on alternative options. So these are the sort of trade-offs that we're thinking about depending on where the services fall in this framework to come back with proposals. On the next slide, I just want to remind again the point that we really have the future in mind when we're thinking about this, and we're drawing upon the previous work that we already were doing to improve our network, the work we were doing to improve our bus service, to redesign our bus network, and to rethink commuter rail so that we can build that future for the region. And so with that in mind, that means changes we make now will be permanent. Not that we won't add service back, but that we will add service back that better serves the region's needs, both based on the work we were previously doing and also our understanding of how COVID and the economic disruption we're currently facing is going to change travel patterns, and work we're doing with MassDOT on scenario planning to think about, and CTPS to think about the future. And finally, to that end, the feedback that we receive through this process will inform both these shorter term decisions on service priorities that we're making, as well as how we build back as resource and riders return. So the next slide I have just talks quickly about next steps. Our staff is currently working on service packages using this framework. And following the release of those packages on November 2nd, we will be doing a public engagement process. But just for a sense of timing, none of these changes would take place until next year, depending on the mode. But they're really aimed to addressing our fiscal 22 budget. And then finally, just for quickly about our public engagement process on the next slide, we're going to be holding 12 virtual public meetings in the month of November mostly. We're also going to be doing proactive non-virtual engagement with communities. We know not everyone can participate in virtual meetings. We know that even before COVID, we really needed to be proactive to reach out to communities most impacted. And so we will be doing proactive non-virtual engagement. We'll have online tools for people who don't have the time to come to a meeting but want to provide feedback to us online. And just quickly, since this is for this particular audience, the meetings will be focused on sort of subparts of the region so that we can sort of talk in detail with stakeholders about potential impacts in their to services in their geography. And then we will have the official public meeting and a system-wide meeting. So that is our public engagement plan. More to come on that. Sam, I will turn it over to you now to talk about the capital side of the work.
Thanks, Laurel. So for context, before I get into the details here, we are here presenting to the MPO not just because you represent many of our stakeholders, but because we need your help and you're part of the solution here. Like Laurel mentioned, before we start talking about and implementing service reductions, we're doing internal work on our own budget, and then also looking at this capital reallocation, which I'll give you more details on. In order to make that a reality, we will need to amend the TIP. So the reason that Laurel and I are here today is because we wanted to give you the full context of everything that's happening rather than just spring on you in a couple of weeks a TIP amendment. So again, this is intended to be context, and again, we appreciate your support because this capital reallocation we're talking about is going to be a really, really critical element in our ability to preserve essential service for the riders that need us most. Let's just get into it. Next slide, please. So I think we skipped a slide. Okay, so the MBTA is not alone in this crisis. Agencies nationwide have been impacted by this dramatic and sustained drop in revenue and ridership and are taking actions to address their gaps. We're also not the only agency considering changes to the capital program. APTA reports that 8 in 10 large agencies are considering delaying, deferring, or canceling capital projects. And we know that Philadelphia, Washington, and New York are all taking action today on capital in order to address their budget challenges. Next slide. So in order to guide our capital program through this uncertainty, we're phasing our work. In the short term, which is what we're doing right now, we're focused on this immediate effort to reallocate funds from capital to operating while continuing active construction projects to keep momentum going. So I want to emphasize that for everyone on the MPO board. We are continuing active construction projects. This effort does not entail stopping projects that are already in construction, like the Green Line extension or South Coast Rail or Positive Train Control. This is about projects that are not yet underway or are flexible enough to be scaled down. So the reallocation exercise is really about identifying projects or scope to pause, not cancel, until funding is available or conditions change. Concurrent with this, we're also aggressively pursuing external funding and financing. We're working very closely with Laurel, Kat, our service planning team, finance, and others to make sure that all of our decisions are using the same data, assumptions, and framework as the service and budget discussions. And when it comes time to propose specific actions, particularly on whether or not to pause or advance a major commitment, we're really trying to focus on no regrets decisions and structure any of our near-term investments to preserve maximum flexibility. This is our focus today in the next few months. As the scenario planning process that Laurel mentioned and David's team is supporting us all on matures and progresses, we expect to use the outputs of that to inform our next long-term CIP. But for now, we're focused on this immediate reallocation exercise. Next slide, please. So as we approach the exercise, there's a few major principles that we're holding dear. First, it is critical to maintain separation of the operating and capital budgets. As many of you know, in 2015, one of the things the governor's special panel found was that the T routinely diverted funds from capital to operating, which contributed to the large and unaddressed backlog of capital needs. And the panel recommended a firewall between capital and operating, which the T has since implemented and enforced via our capital expense policy. Therefore, flexing federal funds for preventative maintenance, which is really the gist of what we're talking about here, is a temporary measure, not a long-term fix. Next slide. And a related principle is that we will do everything we can to continue the upward trajectory of capital investment. Last year, the T set records by investing nearly $1.7 billion in capital projects, including $1.2 billion in maintenance and modernization. And this kind of sustained investment is really critical to addressing our capital needs, advancing strategic priorities, and continuing to deliver safe and reliable service for our customers. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we're conducting parallel processes, and this is, I think, another way where the MPO can potentially be helpful. So we're reviewing the capital program to identify projects for reallocation, while also aggressively pursuing additional funding to minimize the impact of revenue loss on the capital program. So our team started by reviewing all projects in our capital investment plan, which includes both federal funding, but also MBTA, state funding, and other types of funding, to identify how much of the portfolio was currently obligated on active contracts, how much has flexibility for reallocation, and following that, we are currently developing proposals consistent with the principles and framework discussed today. At the same time, we're seeking alternative funding and financing. We recently received $20 million in FHWA redistribution funds via MassDOT, which we're planning to use for bus lane construction, which will also be part of our TIP amendment. We also recently submitted a technology grant for bus dispatching. We're actively preparing for a grade crossing safety grant, a trans-oriented development grant, and we're also actively preparing for the next round of discretionary grant opportunities, which will come when federal appropriations are passed. Looking longer term, we're engaged with the US DOT Build America Bureau on low interest financing through TIFI and RIF, and we're also preparing to submit a letter of interest for the FTA core capacity program for the Green Line transformation. So really what I mean to show you here is that while part of this process is about identifying projects to pause or scale back, at the same time, we're trying to be as aggressive as possible in identifying other sources that could fill that gap. Next slide. So this slide shows our anticipated 5-year capital funding sources pre-COVID on the left, and on the right, the estimated capital funding sources with 2 new assumptions. First, the federal portion reflects a reallocation of $460 million, which is our high target under this scenario. And that reflects a maximum reallocation of available 5307 funds in 21 and 22, tapering off in FY23. As the MPO board knows, Section 5307, which is the Urbanized Area Grant Program, is one of 3 formula programs that helps fund the MBTA and is programmed through the TIP. This is the most flexible program that we're provided through the FTA, and preventative maintenance is an eligible cost under Section 5307, which is why we are targeting those funds for reallocation. The other change in assumption here is a transfer between lockbox and bond, as you all may recall from previous presentations or your kind of watching of the FMCB, if you choose to do that. Over the last several years, any savings that the MBTA has had on the operating budget has been reinvested in the capital program through a mechanism called the lockbox. Given our current revenue challenges, the expectation moving forward is that there will not be any lockbox funds available for capital expenses. Right now, we are using a portion of that for capital salaries because there is a legislative prohibition on charging capital program salaries to bond funds, but that restriction we anticipate to be lifted either with the passage of the bond bill or potentially the passage of the budget because the governor's office has sent up language to be included in either or both mechanism. So one thing I just want to note here is that even after the proposed reallocation, the MBTA still anticipates over $9 billion available for capital investment over the next 5 years. Next slide, please. So moving from the process to set funding targets to the process to identify projects for reallocation, as mentioned, the first step was to review the entire CIP and identify how much of the portfolio is currently allocated to active contracts. This review showed that 334 projects, over 2/3 of our current capital investment program, are tied to active contracts with no flexibility to scale down or pause without penalties. So then moving to the next step, the team segmented the projects with flexibility into 2 groups. First, we identified 4 major initiatives with significant upcoming commitments: bus and bus facilities, Green Line transformation, stations and wayfinding, and commuter rail capacity. And next, flexible projects that didn't fit into those categories were segmented by status, which broke down into new projects, projects in design, partially funded projects, and on-call projects. Next slide. The overall takeaway of this first step of analysis is that most of our capital program is currently committed on active contracts. 73% or $1.7 billion, as you see in the chart in front of you, of our 1-year CIP funding is tied to projects with no flexibility. An additional $300 million or so is tied to projects anticipated to be awarded before the end of the calendar year. So this means 2 things. 1, that we need to act quickly to identify which projects to pause. And 2, that a successful strategy will likely combine deferring projects that have not yet started and scaling back or pausing projects that are already in design or potentially underway. Next slide. So You saw the framework that Laurel included on the service planning side. We adapted that to capital projects. You see on the left, on the y-axis, is number of riders, either current or rider propensity. And then we added characteristics of projects on the top, on the x-axis. There's a few considerations that I want to highlight. First, safety is our top priority and is never compromised. Safety investments might be needed for projects we plan to pause or scale back, and we will work within the T to identify those safety critical investments and scope elements. Second, while this framework is a helpful guide, we will also weigh project flexibility and anticipated benefits to transit-dependent riders as other factors in decision making. And third, new projects, so that's projects that have not started yet, in all categories may be paused or scaled down, since they're the easiest to hold and then quickly restart when funds become available. So to give you a bit of an overview here, moving from left to right, safety and maintenance projects are the ones most likely to remain fully funded. Some projects could be scaled back to safety critical elements, particularly in low ridership environments. ADA accessibility projects may be continued, scaled back, or paused based on the level of impact consistent with our PADI process and anticipated ridership. Projects that add capacity or other rider amenities may be continued on the modes with durable ridership like bus, or may be paused or scaled down given the uncertainty about when and where riders will return. And finally, projects that expand the network are most likely to be paused given the need to focus resources on preserving essential service. So I'm just going to pause for a moment to let folks digest this, because this is really a critical part in our decision-making framework, and then we will move to next steps. All right, let's go to the next slide. So what happens next, and this is particularly on the capital side. So on October 5th, we presented a version of this to our Fiscal Management Control Board, and they gave us guidance to proceed. Here we are today presenting both this and our service planning framework to you all, because again, the Boston Region MPO is going to be a critical partner in the capital reallocation process. On November 2nd, the plan is to present the specific proposals, including which projects to pause or scale back, to our FMCB. We will then do a reprise for the MassDOT Capital Programs Committee. We anticipate the next FMCB meeting on the 16th. If needed, we will get approval from the FMCB. It's also possible they may give us the go-ahead on the 2nd. And then right now the plan is to return to you all on November 19th with a TIP amendment that reflects a reallocation, or really a change in our 5307 funds from specific projects to preventative maintenance. We would provide 21 days of public comment per the requirements, and then before the end of the calendar year, hopefully we would receive your endorsement of our TIP amendment. And then there's some administrative steps before we could actually draw down the funds. That is what we're looking at. Again, the reason that we are moving quickly is that the faster we could get assurance on the capital reallocation, the more guidance and input we can give to our service planning team in terms of how and where they make their adjustments. I think the last slide is just maybe no, that's it. So that is the conclusion. I know that was a lot, but Laurel and I are here to answer your questions, and we can certainly go back to any one of the slides if there's an interest. Thank you, everyone.
I know Brian Kane had questions because he told me he did in the chat box. So let's go to Brian first. Go ahead, Brian.
There we go. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just wanted to follow up and suggest that this is in many ways the least bad alternative. It's a shame that we find ourselves back here in this position. This is at least the 5th major MBTA financial crisis that I've dealt with in my career. And I think I'm forgetting a few, but we're here. And I give credit to the team, to the leadership, to Laurel, to Samantha, to everyone working on this, trying to find a way to dig out of the hole that COVID has put us in. But let's not forget that the hole that the T is in is because of its structural and cyclical deficit. COVID has only sort of ripped the mask off, ironically enough, this time today. So the advisory board traditionally has opposed flexing capital funds to operating. Traditionally in the past, the T has spent so little on its capital program that the 5307 money was really critical to making sure that at least something got done. However, it is important to note that in the last 5 years, the MBTA has really ramped up its spending, between over $1 billion for the last several years up to 1.7 billion this year. So in many ways, the 5307 money, while very important, is less important than it was several years ago. So while the advisory board in the past would have opposed anything like this, today, well, I guess I'm not happy, but I will say that we are in support of this amendment to the TIP. The other reason that I think it's important that we support this is that if the MPO does not amend the TIP, that means the T is going to have to find the 80 to 160 million dollars in its own budget, and that will mean deeper cuts, more draconian service reductions, and leaving more people literally on the side of the road. So, it is a Hobbesian choice in many ways. The MBTA is often faced with such Hobbesian choices, and is asked to make the least bad alternative, or to be the least bad choice. This is the least bad choice, and for that reason, the advisory board will be supporting this proposal when it comes up in the future. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Brian. Jay Monty.
Thank you, Sam and Laurel. Obviously this is a tough year, and I just want to applaud you guys for, taking on this challenge. It's not an easy discussion to have with, not only us, but I think the communities as well. So I start off saying I'm impressed by the amount of thought and effort going into this. And I agree with Brian that I think, desperate times do call for desperate measures. Looking at this in sort of two ways, I could take the view of, and this is a general statement, Everett being a community that has a lot of dependent transit riders, and I could look at this and say, hey, look, we're going to be spared some of these cuts perhaps, and continue to see investment. But I could look at this the other way and say, I think historically speaking, a healthy transit system relies on not only those who depend on transit, but those who choose to take transit. And so I just say that with the hope that as you guys move forward, this kind of the rebuilding of service in the future does look to folks that don't just depend on it, but that choose to ride the T. Those folks do bring with them political capital in the long run. I think, not that we're willing to give up more service here, but just to say that, I think there's a bigger picture here. I think remembering that it's taken the T now 55, 60 years to claw back even a fraction of the service and infrastructure that was lost in the preceding 2 decades after World War II. So, as we consider service cuts and, changes to infrastructure, I hope that is considered that, things that go away are very hard to bring back. And I would hate to see the system in the long run be something that is really just for those who absolutely depend on it because they have no other choice. It really needs to be a system for everybody. I think that view benefits not only the region, but also communities that do depend on the T, like Everett. So that's all I have, but thank you.
Eric Barassa.
Thank you, David. Yeah, I want to echo what Brian and Jay said. I think you guys have, done a lot of great work and really thoughtful planning here. I have really 2 questions. Samantha, just to be clear, what is the total amount of savings that you all are looking for from the capital budget? And then is all of that, I guess the second part of my question is all of that savings to go to operating to help with the operating deficit, or are you also proposing capital changes that would support capital, like new different capital projects that might actually improve the service where we know it's very resilient? Like, for example, moving money from like maybe commuter rail where there's, low ridership to to a bus corridor where there is high ridership right now?
That's a good question, Eric. So Jonathan or whomever's controlling the slides, can we go back to the one that was the bar graph side by side, please? That one. Yep. So under the bullet that says federal section 5307, so the target we're going towards, which is aggressive, is this $460 million. And what that reflects is we currently have 80 million in unobligated federal fiscal year 20 funds, and that means they've been programmed in the TIP, they've been appropriated and apportioned by Congress and OMB and FTA, but we have not yet put them on grants. So those would be funds that we could access as soon as the TIP amendment is endorsed. And then right now the plan is we get about 150 million a year through 5307, and the plan would be to set aside all of that in fiscal year 21, which is this fiscal year, all of that in fiscal year 22, and then wean ourselves off beginning in fiscal year 23. The reason that we're starting with a aggressive scenario is we know that capital commitments are sticky and have long tails. So if we started a project, let's say now or in the next 6 months, and then later decided that we needed that money, that would be very difficult to undo, where it's easier for us to say, for now, we're going to put some things on pause, reallocate money to the operating budget, and if ridership is, comes back better than we anticipate or faster than we anticipate, or if we get additional federal money, let's say, we can then flip things back on and we would come back to you and we would have another TIP amendment and so on and so forth. So the plan right now is for this most aggressive scenario, which is 460 million. So that's your first question. On the second question.
And that's all for operating. That would be for ready to support the operating budget.
Ready to support the operating budget. So we have about 200 million a year in preventative maintenance costs that we think can be easily eligible for this, and possibly more. So that would be for preventive maintenance, which again is an eligible expense under Title 46. So we're, everything is kind of compliant. And then to your second question about whether we're just reallocating or if we're also thinking about, kind of shifts between modes. Right now, we are kind of doing everything we can to get to that $460 million target. If during that effort, and what I've heard from the board, and you may have heard if you listened, they were worried that might be too much. That said, if we can go further, that's when we might start thinking about reallocating to durable modes. The other thing I'll mention is that we are, starting to think about our next full CIP process. And because by the spring, we'll know more about COVID, we'll know more about the recovery, and we'll have a bit more of this scenario planning done, that might be the point at which we start thinking about real modal shifts. But for right now, our focus is really on this operating budget deficit.
Thank you.
Next up, Sheila Page.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I like your decision matrix. I think it makes sense. But I would like to reiterate what Jay had said. These changes will have kind of a long horizon effect. And I don't want to lose sight of those people that don't need transportation but want to take transportation, because I think that's a great, our traffic, the status as we come out of the COVID situation, as the traffic increases, I think those people are key to our region's economic development, that they remain on public transit as opposed to hopping back in their cars. And then thank you for that. But I had just a clarifying question. So the federal, this money, your MBTA, it's money that MBTA already has. You're just reallocating where it's being spent and when it's being spent. Is that correct?
Yes. So in our last 5-year TIP, which the MPO endorsed over the summer, probably, that these monies were allocated to specific capital projects. And what we will be coming back with is, instead of specific capital projects, much of that money going towards preventative maintenance. The slight complication here, and I will try to be as kind of clear and transparent with everyone as possible, is that because the MBTA has other funding sources, we're not just looking at the existing slate of 5307 projects. We're looking at our whole capital program. So some of those 5307 projects may be sources for reallocation, but some of those 5307 projects may shift to a different funding source, and then another project funded by that other funding source will be the reallocation. So there might be a couple of like multi-step moves that, again, we will try as much as possible to be clear and transparent about what is happening. We're not just eliminating all the projects that are currently on the tip, but rather finding a variety of solutions of how we can fund different things.
Okay, thank you. It's a huge puzzle.
Yes, I call it Sudoku frequently.
Yeah.
Which, thanks.
Thank you.
David Kozis.
Okay, thank you. And I really appreciate all these tough choices. And the thing that Laurel mentioned at the beginning is that the T's trying not to recreate the bus network that we had, but something more focused in certain areas, and that these changes would be permanent. And so just, similar to what Jay and Sheila and Eric said, is, one concern that I do have for areas that might have more access to cars or more access to telecommuting is that these communities can anticipate service cuts that might be significant. And, we've already seen this during even before the pandemic, but especially during the pandemic. And I think it was reasonable, during the pandemic, but the idea that these service cuts might be permanent is alarming to me, especially because I think that some of these communities that might be losing transit service permanently are actively, currently trying to add more housing to address our regional housing crisis. And, we're trying to build less parking, right, to try to address the climate crisis that we all hear about and think about. We want fewer cars. We want fewer cars. And I'm just not sure how to think about, more development at the same time that we're, focusing on less parking, at the same time that we're now thinking that we might see even more service cuts to transit that might be permanent. Thank you.
You do. Jean Constable.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I also want to say first, thank you and acknowledge the work that's gone into this. I think we've heard about Herculean tasks for the past 8 months, and I'm no doubt that this is one of them. But I do have to let you know that, there's a very, very anxious subregion on the South Shore right now, and that's with the proposal of elimination or even a reduction in ferry service. Quite honestly, one of the concerns I have is that some of the determinants in determining or proposing to eliminate ferry services really does run afoul of a lot of the objectives and principles which the long-range transportation plan is based off of, such as safety, equity, clean air and sustainability, economic vitality. Thank you, David. That's exactly right. I know on the South Shore, there has been substantial work in both state and local investment around housing development, affordable housing development, transit-oriented development, economic development, and to cut off a subregion by nearly eliminating one entire mode of transportation in the ferry system. It has a lot of people nervous and anxious down here, and quite honestly, it makes me shake my head if I'm being truthful. So I would just, I have to communicate that to both the MPO and the staff. but also ask that there are at a minimum alternatives to eliminating ferry service. I think that the metrics will never compare when you're looking at ferry service. We only have so many vessels and we have a finite number of passengers. So when you compare that to rail service, they don't really equate, and ridership numbers might always appear to be lower. So please keep all of those things in consideration as it relates to the ferry service. I'm sure you'll be hearing more throughout the process from South Shore. Thank you.
Thank you.
David, can I jump in actually?
Of course, Laura, go ahead.
Sure. Thank you for everyone's feedback. I think the word permanent sounds scary, but the reason why we're saying that is actually so that we can address exactly the things that you have been raising about how the region is changing. And so one of the reasons why we're saying that is so that we can add back service where we see demand, whether that's demand from new housing developments that have been built, whether that's demand from different travel patterns that are developing of different economic outcomes that come out of the pandemic. So I think the reason we're saying that is so that we can make sure that we're actually being responsive to the cities and towns and how things are changing throughout the region, knowing that was already happening before the pandemic, but that this is a moment in which we have to act more quickly. And so a lot of the work we were doing before, like the bus network redesign, for example, or the commuter rail vision project, was to start doing that work. And we're just saying that in some ways, this might escalate some of those decisions quicker, given that, change has happened faster around us. And so I want to I know the word permanent sounds really scary, and it's not that there will be no service. It's just that the service, we're hoping to bring back service in a way that better serves the needs of the region. And so that's the goal. And that when we get more resources, just to put back the service that we had before, because it might not actually work for people.
Thank you, Laura. Leonard?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So yeah, I understand the difficulty of all this. And as you might imagine, being a member of the Right of Oversight Committee, nothing depresses me more, than seeing what's happening to our transit system. But I know that everyone's working to do the best that they can in this situation. And so my question is perhaps to both of you when it comes to scenario planning, is that I really feel that this needs a statewide approach to things, meaning that I feel it can't be just the MBTA and MAPC, doing scenario planning in isolation. I think the Future Transportation Committee that was created by the governor, and I thought I had some very good scenarios. It would be good to maybe bring some of those people in and MassDOT in to really think about how we plan for the future of transit within the overall transportation system, under various scenarios. And so I would encourage that. And I guess to Laurel, my question is based on the other work plans that we see that we're going to discuss, if indeed the analysis on equity comes back saying that there is disproportionate impact on minorities and low income, what impact would that have? And before stopping and let you ask that question, my also concern is that even if we were to see that there wasn't a bigger impact on one population versus the other, I think we can probably agree that the low income people are going to be affected more, even if more low income people aren't affected more than, even if the number of low income people affected isn't greater than the number of non-low income people affected. So that's it. Thank you.
Things, Lynn. To the question of the equity analysis that's on the, thank you for bringing that up, that's on the agenda today. That those are, those scopes are to address two actual requirements. One is the Title VI requirement for a major service change for the MBTA. We're anticipating that it will be a major service change and want to get the work going so that we can start the equity analysis. And then the other requirement is a state statutory requirement for us around air quality analysis. So that's one scope. The other scope is for GLX, which is we want to do concurrently, understanding that all of these decisions are all intertwined. So those are the two scopes, and that our requirements, but also our intention and commitment to equity would dictate that if we have a finding of a, disproportionate impact or disparate burden, we would change or mitigate the proposals. So they will definitely inform our decision making to make sure that we are making equitable decisions.
And on the question about scenario planning, David's team is very much working on that with, I think, some of the same staff that helped advise the commission. So David, I don't know if you want to say anything about the approach you all are taking.
Yeah, so in this immediate term, and this is a long-term iterative process, but in the immediate term, we are looking at developing 3 scenarios that are short-term scenarios, looking at the post-COVID future for FY21, 22, and 23 in order to help inform the T budget process. Long-term, we will expand it to look at longer-term impacts and probably at that point go to a more statewide analysis. But right now, our analysis is focused on the Boston region writ large, the MBTA service area.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Tom Bent.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much. A lot of what I was going to say has already been said by Jay, David, Eric, and a few others. But one of the things that I want to bring up is, just to kind of reiterate, is that, not only Somerville, but all the intercore committees have been rising to the challenge of providing much needed housing and affordable housing in the intercore. And all those decisions have been based on more public transportation, not less. So we really want to, zoning decisions like Somerville just, through a painful process of over 5 or 6 years, changed their zoning quite a bit. And it was all based on less parking, less cars on the road, things like that. We've added bus lanes, bike lanes, all those different things. So really want, when these decisions are being thought of, is to remember that commitment and all that work that has been done to basically, because of climate change and all the other things that we've been talking about for years, want to make sure that we're not, pushing those priorities backwards. And I think even though these are really difficult times, we still have to be thinking forward. So, but thank you. I know this isn't an easy task at all.
Thank you, Tom. Jay, you got something else?
I'm probably echoing others here, and David and Tom and Len and Jen. I think there's often a little bit of a worldview conflict here. That I think what I hear coming from the T very often is that they're responding. They're a responsive agency. They respond to demand. But I think from our view in municipalities, we look at it the other way, which is that we respond to the service provided, the service available. And Tom just, I think, described that pretty well. I mean, there will be, without a doubt, if there are service reductions, that will very much affect the style and pace of development around these communities. And I've brought this up, before, where we have the area in Everett we call a commercial triangle, which is presumably part of the future Silver Line alignment. But despite rezoning, despite having conversations with developers, we can't get parking numbers down because there isn't service. And so I think it's one thing to say we're going to reduce service, and I know this is a conversation that's going to play out over the next several months. But I would really caution against, total service elimination on routes. The idea that we can just bring service back, that's easy just to bring service back. Look at the history of this, or even whether it's modern history or back decades ago, it is exceedingly difficult to bring service back where you've eliminated it, and it's very expensive. So I emphasize that the cities, the towns, the regions are going to react to whatever decisions the T makes. It's not the other way around. It's not just the T reacting to save itself. and respond to what is happening here. So I just emphasize that again, and hopefully that'll be part of the discussion moving forward.
Thanks, Jay. Eric Barassa?
And just to put a finer point on the, the nexus of these decisions with land use and so many municipalities that are trying to get parking down, we know from so much of our research that, once someone owns an automobile or a household owns multiple automobiles, that automobile gets used. So the average car in Massachusetts drives about 10,000 miles a year. So if you have one, your household drives 10,000 miles a year. If you have two, your household drives 20,000 miles a year. And so, if our goal is also to decrease VMT, these things are just, connected. And obviously we're looking at the future, but I just think that's a really good point for all of us to understand. It's just the decisions that are being made locally about land use, TOD, and parking are obviously wrapped up in these decisions too.
Thanks, Eric. Any other MPO members at this time before I open up to the public? Seeing none. Abby Swain.
Hi, thank you. Sorry for that fumble there with the mic. My first comment is with my extracurricular hat on, representing United Spinal Greater Boston Chapter and also Brookline's Council on Disability. I think rethinking the network and service levels really needs to be done, but it puts an awful lot of pressure on the MBTA's powers of analysis and their ability to reach constituents who might be affected, which is very difficult even in non-COVID times. So there's a risk of overlooking important factors and facts for the analysis. This is a little scary, but I have confidence that if anybody can do it, Laurel and her colleagues can. More specifically, how is the MBTA assessing current and potential future ridership for disabled persons? There needs to be a way of separating the disabled from the elderly in doing this analysis, due in part to the increased susceptibility to complications from COVID. Use of the system by disabled persons, both paratransit and conventional transit, is greatly depressed nowadays. And because the disabled, particularly those with mobility challenges such as wheelchair users, are underrepresented currently in using the fixed route system due to ongoing ADA deficits, we have a chicken egg problem of sort in assessing the demand and prioritizing expenditures. So I would advocate staying the course with accessibility projects.
Thank you. Laurel is back. Laurel had a momentary internet outage. Laurel, the question was, how are we assessing potential future demand and ridership of our customers with disabilities? And how do we differentiate that from elderly customers?
Yes, so sorry, my internet went down for a minute. So we are looking at the data for seniors and people with disabilities on a route level, because we know those decisions are very sort of geographically specific, and that ridership is. And so most of the analysis we've done so far has been at the mode level. And so at the route level, we're going to be using the data we have from our fare collection system for the senior and TAP card usage, both during the pandemic, but then also before the pandemic as well, to look at where those trips are being taken or were being taken. In addition to doing community outreach, we're briefing our RTAC advisory group this evening, and then we're also meeting with other organizations as well. So sorry I missed the question. I hope that answers it.
Thank you, Laurel. Next question from Andrea Downs.
Hi, I'm a city councilor from Newton, and listening in on this, and I'm alarmed because we are currently hearing from constituents when we're considering transit-oriented development and changing zoning the way Somerville has to require less parking and in fact restrict parking near T-stops. that, if the T is cutting service, they want us to, reverse all of that and go back. So keep in mind, just like the gentleman from Somerville said, that just like the T is responsive to us, we are responsive to what the T does. And I wanted to second those comments. Thank you.
You're welcome. Lynn Diggins.
Yeah, this is a bit to what Eric has said about people having cars and using them. And I think we need to keep in mind, though, that even though people use the cars, the car really isn't used a lot. The percentage of time that a car is used, I think, is in the like 5 to 10% range. And so I think if people had access, one of the problems with public transit is its frequency and where it goes. I think if people had the ability to call on transit, when they wanted and could go where they wanted, they would use transit and not really rely on a vehicle. I could go on, but this isn't the place for it. But all I'm asking is that when we do start thinking about scenario planning, that we really think about the future that we want to have. I often say this is like, we should plan for what we want and not simply respond to what's going on. There will always be that element of response, but it can be within the framework of us having a real vision of where we want to go. And I like to see that vision in the scenario planning. So all I ask is to those of you who are doing scenario planning, if you could stand the thought of having me more involved in it, I would love to be more involved. So I can talk less, but I really would like to hear more. Thank you.
Len, we always appreciate your perspective, and we'll definitely reach out and engage with you and your team.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments at this time? As was noted at the beginning, this is just the preview. We will be back in next month to talk about an actual tip amendment that defines the projects that will be paused. Any other comments or questions?
I believe that Abby Swain has a follow-up.
Oh, Abby?
Hi, this is with my other hat on, my EPA trade programs hat. A December 2019 Keolis analysis of winter commuter rail performance identified needed investments in upgrading, otherwise known as doing substantial maintenance on older and flawed newer locomotives to reduce the need to idle long-term in yards during cold weather. The MBTA has since presented their intentions for accomplishing these upgrades to the Fiscal Management Control Board, which met with their approval. And the MBTA's ownership of equipment maintenance challenges is part of their refreshed contract with Keolis. Since skimping on locomotive maintenance also affects reliability, which in turn affects customer satisfaction, keeping these upgrades to locomotives in the budget is advisable.
Thank you. Any other comments? Seeing none, as I said, next month, Sam will be back to talk about the actual tip amendment. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Laurel.
Thank you, everyone.
The next item on the agenda is related to the last item. It is the previous item. It is the work scope for service equity and environmental analysis for SFY 2022 MBTA service changes. Stephen Andrews.
Hello. My name is Stephen Andrews, and today I'll be presenting 2 work scopes, and each of these work scopes contains a Title VI service equity analysis component. So I'm going to be on the second scope, I'm going to be skipping a few steps here. And Laurel already gave everybody a little bit of a preview there. So that might also shorten things up here. So today I'm going to be presenting the work program for the service equity and air quality analysis for the upcoming state fiscal year 2022 MBTA service changes. This work, which is expected to cost $66,500 and take 5 months, is funded by the MBTA. As Laurel just presented, the MBTA is expecting to make major service cuts starting July 1st, 2021. And these changes are expected to meet the MBTA's major service change definition in their disparate impact disproportionate burden policy, or DIDB, if you're more familiar with that. As a recipient of federal funding, the MBTA must comply with Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And under that, FTA has published Circular 4702.1b, which provides guidance on how to abide by those laws. The MBTA is required to conduct a service equity analysis, which is designed to gauge whether certain protected populations, that's people of color or minorities and people who have lower incomes, are affected more than their counterparts. And we need to make sure that it's either positive or negatively affected. So to accomplish this equity analysis, staff hopes to use the in-house developed Modified Transit Opportunity Index, affectionately known as MTWA, which is a measure of the amount of transit service supplied to a population. This tool uses the GTFS files or the MBTA schedule files to evaluate the effects of implementing service changes. However, staff is going to need to work with the MBTA and our federal partners to determine the specific tools and methodologies we'll actually use to conduct that service equity analysis. Further, under Mass General Law, the MBTA must complete an environmental notification form, or an ENF, that includes an evaluation of potential environmental impacts of major changes to the system. And CTPS will conduct an environmental impact review to support the ENF. In this analysis, staff will estimate the baseline auto and transit emissions and compare these to emissions resulting from service change related mode shift. This analysis, really both of the analyses, are going to be complicated by the rapid uptake of telecommuting across the country and certainly in the Boston region. So staff is again going to work with the MBTA and our relevant partners to select the specific data sets and methodologies that will address the changes due to COVID-19. Last, we're going to document both of these analyses and send results off to the people who need the results. So if anyone has any questions, I'd be pleased to answer them, or if I can't, work with our contacts to find them. If there's any specific questions about service changes, I certainly hope that Laurel is still on the call.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen. Any questions for Stephen? Seeing none, can I get a motion in a second to approve as presented? And please state your name for the record. Brian Kane.
Brian Kane moves approval, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Eric Barassa.
I make the second.
Thank you. Motion having been made and seconded. Jonathan, please call the roll.
David Moeller,
Yes.
John Bouchard,
John Bouchard, yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Samantha Silverberg,
Yes.
Laura Gilmore,
Yes.
Eric Barassa,
Yes.
Brian Kane,
Shockingly, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Tom Kazis,
Kaz yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
It's yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Sheila Page,
Yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Patrick Keyser,
Patrick Keyser votes yes.
Darlene Wynn,
Darlene Wynn votes yes.
Jennifer Constable,
Jennifer Constable, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Yes.
Motion carries unanimously, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda is the work scope for the service equity analysis for the Green Line extension. Stephen?
Hello, I am still Stephen Andrews. So this is another work scope we have. It's kind of a similar work scope. We're going to be conducting a service equity analysis for the Green Line extension. This work, expected to cost $37,000 and take 5 months, is also funded by the MBTA. The MBTA plans to open new branches of the Green Line in August and October of 2021. And Circular 4702.1B indicates that agencies implementing new starts, small starts, and new fixed guideway projects must conduct Title VI service equity analyses 6 months prior to the start of service, which is early 2021. So we need to conduct a service equity analysis. It would have been a major service change anyways, but it's also specifically called out in the circular that we need to do it 6 months prior to service. Again, staff hopes to use MTWA to complete this analysis, but we will again have to work with MBTA and the FTA to settle on an appropriate methodology and data sets. This will be similarly complicated with the state fiscal year 2022 service changes will complicate this, and the uptick of telecommuting will complicate this as well. So if you have any questions, again, please to answer them or figure out answers for you.
Thanks, Stephen. Any questions for Stephen from members? Seeing none, can I get a motion and a second to approve as presented today? And please state your name for the record. Tom Bent.
Tom Bent, I'll make that motion to approve.
Eric Barassa.
Eric Barassa, I make the second.
Thank you. Motion having been made and seconded, please call the roll, Jonathan.
David Moeller,
Yes.
John Bouchard,
John Bouchard, yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Samantha Silverberg,
Yes.
Laura Gilmore,
Yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Brian Kane,
Brian Kane, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Tom Kazis,
Yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Sheila Page,
Yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Patrick Keyser,
Patrick Keyser votes yes.
Darlene Wynn,
Darlene Wynn, yes.
Jennifer Constable,
Jennifer Constable, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Motion carries unanimous.
Thank you, Jonathan. Next item on the agenda is a work scope for the Green Line Corridor Transformation Study. Bruce Kaplan.
Thank you, David. As you just said, this is a work scope that was requested, our assistance on the Green Line Transformation Project by MassDOT and the MBTA. And specifically, we were asked to help use the various tools that we have to measure the impacts of enhancement on the Green Line surface branches in terms of ridership and accessibilities. And of course, using our travel demand model and various other tools we have. But again, this is just on some improvements on the surface branches of the Green Line, such as station consolidation, some planned stuff and some proposed. There's track realignment, there's increased accessibility and some station siting. And what we are proposing to do here is for both 2030 and 2040 years in the future to measure and model a suite of improvements for each branch individually, except for the excuse me, there's the except for one branch, shall we say. We're gonna look at the B and the C branch, and the E branch, but not the D branch. We're gonna look at those individually. Then we're gonna do a combined analysis. What happens if you do all of these sorts of impacts and bundle them all together? See what you get if you have those enhancements. Then there's an additional one that specifically had come out of the, or at least had been advanced in the Go Boston process, and that is the extension of the Green Line from its current terminus to Hyde Square and Jamaica Plain. And that may involve other sorts of things, such as modifying the 39 bus and other transit services. But again, that will be built off of the previous combined sort of enhancement scenario. And we will measure that. Naturally, we will do environmental justice analyses, and primarily, I think, focusing on that E-line extension scenario, because again, that was called out as in the Go Boston study as a way of offering some better transit connections to an existing environmental study community, environmental justice community. And we will document, of course, how we did this and all these results. It's projected to take about a year, and we are budgeting it for $157,000. I believe the project manager is dialing in right now, or calling in right now. I don't know if Doug Johnson is on the call yet. I see him. He's popped in. So I don't know if Doug wanted to add anything, but Doug and I will be happy to answer any sorts of questions that you might have on this sort of project.
Thank you, Bruce. Are there questions for Bruce or Doug? Brian Kane.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So with regard to the scope, you mentioned extending the line to Hyde Square. Is there also scope to consider terminating the line at Brigham Circle, which is something that's done now? And also with respect to the E branch west of Brigham, are you going to look at the creation and the operational impacts of a dedicated bus rail right-of-way on Huntington west of Brigham Circle all the way to either Heath and or Hyde Square? And finally, I don't think we should be even considering extending the Green Line to Hyde Square if it's going to operate in mixed traffic. I think we need to operate fewer light rail vehicles in mixed traffic and not more. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian.
Hi everyone, this is Doug Johnson from the MassDOT Office of Transportation Planning. I can respond to that comment. We are actually working on a study right now with a consultant team that is analyzing a dedicated transitway on Huntington Ave west of Brigham Circle. And that same consultant team is studying extending the E branch from Heath Street down to Hyde Square. We're working with the Green Line Transformation Office on those studies. Those will be completed pretty early on in Bruce's process, and then what Bruce models will be dependent upon the recommendations of our studies and what we come to an agreement with GLT. It may be the case that our study does not recommend extending the Hyde Square, or it may be that extension only works under certain conditions. We're still pretty early on in that process, and you know, it's too early to release any conclusions or anything, but Bruce's study is going to be based off of the findings from our ongoing studies.
Thank you, Doug. Jim Fitzgerald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just wanted to first off start off by saying, you know, thanks to MassDOT, MBTA, BTPS for taking on this important work. And I think, as Bruce noted, this was one of our kind of long-term recommendations in Go Boston 2030. So we definitely appreciate us continuing to plan and evaluate it. So I think Brian brings up some excellent points, you know, about, you know, the assumptions of the extension of the service. And then I kind of hoping that you know, some sort of protected corridor is hopefully an option. But I guess we'll see the results of this work and the work that Doug mentioned. So, and again, just looking forward to continuing to work with you guys on this, and obviously with BPDA planning, BTD planning, and our BTD transit team specifically. So That's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Jim. Any other MPO members with comments? Seeing none, Franklin, and please state your name and any affiliation if you have one for the record.
Hello, my name is Franklin Salambeni. I'm sorry that my last name is not up on the screen there. I'm the chair of the Arbor Committee for Public Transit in Jamaica Plain, and the extension of the Green Line to Hyde Square is raised in several contexts, and they're important contexts. One is that Hyde Square is an environmental justice neighborhood, and I heard earlier in the meeting discussion about serving in just environmental justice constituencies. The extension of the Green Line to Hyde Square would assist this Latino quarter, which the city has now designated it as, in providing them with a one-seat ride into the central subway. Also, and very much importantly, the BPDA has designated South Huntington Avenue as a development corridor, and development is going up along South Huntington Avenue since development started, and when this phase finally concludes with the rebuilding of the Goddard House, there'll be an additional 1,000 residents living along South Huntington Avenue. The 39 bus, with regard to providing service, is really quite inadequate. And if you look at the ridership figures on the 39 bus going back to the middle 1990s, the ridership has fallen from approximately 19,000 daily riders to just 11,000 daily riders during this period. And I will add that the loss of ridership is due in significant part to the fact that the 39 bus is caught in traffic, not just from Brigham Circle or South Huntington Avenue up to Heath Street, but all the way into Copley Square and Back Bay. I understand there are issues, and the T has long sought to terminate this service at Brigham Circle, and so I wasn't surprised at Mr. Kane's suggestion that that might be studied. I think the idea here is to expand public transit and not to reduce it. And so the Arbor Way Committee for Public Transit, in conjunction with the Main Streets, Mission Hill Main Streets, the Community Association of Mission Hill, the Jamaica Pond Association, the Jamaica Plain Neighborhood Council, have all been very firm and strong in supporting the extension of this line to Hyde Square. And I can assure you that we look very much forward to the work of the Green Line Study Committee or the Surface Line Study Committee in coming forward with a proposal. The funding for this feasibility study is included in the Transportation Bond Bill. It's supported strongly by Senator Sonia Chang Diaz and Representative Nika Elguardo. And so we look forward to the work you're going to be doing. We very much want to contribute and assist in whatever way we can. We're certainly open to discussing with this body and with the T Transformation Committee. So I really want to thank you for including this in your proposal.
Thank you,
and I want to thank the chair for giving me the opportunity to say hello.
Thank you. Samantha Silverberg.
Hi, I just want to acknowledge the mixed messages perhaps that we're sending right now, that you just heard me and Laurel talk about potentially reducing service and our capital program. And here we're presenting a study about expanding service. And I think this just in many ways demonstrates the unprecedented world that we're in, that things that we initiated some months ago are important. And certainly the kind of transformation of the Green Line is one of those important priorities for the T, but we're also facing a reckoning of how we fit those important things into our resources. So this is a worthwhile study. I'm glad it's being initiated, but I do want to, manage folks' expectations that, as I spoke about in the framework, extensions of service are likely, lower on our priority list than maintaining existing essential service. And I think based on the comments I heard from the MPO board, you all likely agree with that triaging.
Thank you, Sam. Brian Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple other questions just on the scope, as I noted here. I just want to make sure that the scope includes linkage with the Type 10 car development. Specifically, if we're going to have longer revenue vehicles, we need to make sure they can operate in mixed traffic and make the turning radius at South Huntington and Huntington. Also want to ask that the scope or that the report writers consider dispatching. The E branch is dispatched out of Reservoir, I believe, right now. If the line is extended even further from Reservoir, how will operationally that work, especially with the T's stated goal of improving headways in the central subway tunnel? And finally, terminal space in general. I know work has been done on a Green Line car storage. As the line, as Heath Street is no longer used for anything but storage, there's no maintenance, there's no cleaning, et cetera, I don't believe anymore. If the line is extended, I just hope that the scope includes a review of what that would mean in terms of getting cars back to Reservoir to be serviced, have their fare boxes turned, et cetera, et cetera. So this is my final question on the scope, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Bruce or Doug, do you have an answer?
Thank you. Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, just a couple of points. I think storage capacity for Type 10 cars is outside of the scope of work for CTPS, but the Green Line Transformation Office is certainly considering that. I will say the impetus for our studies that are looking at an exclusive transit way on Huntington and extending the E branch to Hyde Square, the impetus came from the fact that the Green Line is going to be trying to move towards Type 10 cars, and from what we understand, Heath Street could not handle two Type 10 cars in its current configuration. So that was a big reason for considering extending it to Hyde Square. I also want to say that the funding for both CTPS's scope and the studies that we're working on is coming from the FHWA. So these are processes, as Samantha said, that have been underway for a long time prior to the current situation with funding at the T. And those studies aren't necessarily impacted by the current scenario, but we're just looking at, a future with Type 10 cars, what that means for the E branch. These are really long-term studies that may make recommendations about operations or transitway configurations, but the implementation of those would be much further off and need to be handled by the Green Line Transformation Office and the MBTA. So I understand that sort of confusion that I probably helped create by referencing those, but these are long-term studies that have been underway for a long time and are not making any recommendations for short-term changes to the E branch.
Thank you, Doug. Laura Gilmore.
Hi there. I just wanted to ask a kind of bigger picture question on this, and I think it's just related to what I think we're all trying to figure out in our planning work right now. So I know that this scope is looking at, a future for 2030 and 2040 when, we assume that this will be in a very different world. But I guess I'm just wondering, based on that, what are you intending to use for your existing conditions? Is this existing conditions pre-COVID, or is there some sort of interplay between this team and the work that's going on forging ahead. So, I mean, if there are baseline service changes for 2022, does that get factored in here? Or are you, kind of looking from before COVID and then just hoping to skip ahead enough that we're into more of a recovery by the time these forecasts are, by the time you're at the horizon that these forecasts are looking at?
Bruce?
I believe that we're, going to take into account some of the stuff that will come out of the forging ahead as much as we can. But I would say that, the base year counts and stuff, this is a process, and we're, at least at CTPS, coming into it, after some other consulting teams have already been working on this. They've did a bunch of data collection, I believe in 2019 and maybe even earlier as part of the Green Line transformation. And we're going to be building off of that kind of for the meat of the, shall we say, Green Line work. If there are other major sorts of, system-wide changes that occur and happen that will be affecting the project, naturally, we think about how we would best incorporate those kind of in the background, shall we say. But again, like kind of the meat of it in terms of base year is going to be right there, pre-COVID conditions. And we'll be working off of those. But yes, it's as soon as we know certain things about the future and they get adopted, whether it's a reduction in commuter rail service or something like that, and they get adopted, then, yes, we can move towards incorporating them in future years.
Marty, you have something you want to add?
Yes, I think Laura's raising a very important point, and this is something we've been talking about a lot at CTPS in considering our models and forecasting to this post-COVID, hopefully, era in 2030 and 2040, and what are the implications on that for our application work as well as our current model development and everything. And really, we all acknowledge this is an unfolding situation. And when we think about the future, we need to talk about it in terms of deep uncertainty. What will be the long-lasting impacts of work from home behavior, transit usage, auto ownership, even home and work locations are all things that, it could be a complete paradigm shift. It could return to what we had before or something in between. Now, testing, actually exploring changes in travel behavior, that's why we have models. That's the power of the model, is that we can actually change our assumptions and run it through. But that kind of use of the models, the more exploratory approach, it's a developing practice still. And this is something I presented on earlier, and we've been working on incorporating utilities to be able to leverage our model in this way, but it is still developing. So our kind of vision is that as we advance this practice through the exploratory modeling work that's going to feed into our scenario planning for our LRTP, we'll draw on that information and those lessons learned to then guide our future model applications, but it is still developing.
Thanks, Marty. Any other questions? Seeing none, can I get a motion and a second to approve as presented today? Eric Barassa.
Eric Barassa, I make the motion to approve this work scope.
Thank you. Tom Bent.
Tom Bent, I'll second that motion.
Thank you. Motion having been made and seconded, Jonathan, please call the roll.
David Moeller,
Yes.
John Bouchard,
John Bouchard, yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Samantha Silverberg,
Yes.
Laura Gilmore,
Yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Brian Kane,
Brian Kane, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Tom Kadzis,
Yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Gerald, yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Sheila Page,
Yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Patrick Keyser,
Patrick Keyser votes yes.
Darlene Nguyen,
Darlene Nguyen, yes.
Jennifer Constable,
Jennifer Constable, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Motion carries unanimously, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Jonathan. Next item on the agenda is the work scope for the future of the curb, phase 2. Paul Christner.
Thank you. Sorry, just unmuting. Good morning, everyone. My name is Paul Christner. I'm here to present the scope for the future of the curb phase 2. This is an MPO funded project. The budget is $60,000 and the schedule is an approximately 11-month schedule. This study will build off the 2019 Future of the Curb study to focus on Boston area curb usage and create a guidebook for municipalities interested in planning and implementing their own curb management strategies. There'll be 2 primary tasks. In the first task, MPO staff will research and investigate specific examples of best practices and innovative solutions for managing curb space in municipalities around the Boston region. The task will include outreach to municipal staff and other relevant officials in the Boston region. MPO staff will also review recent curb usage changes implemented in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, including projects funded by MassDOT's Shared Streets and Spaces programs. The process is used to implement these changes and municipalities' plans to keep these changes post-COVID. In the second task, based on the research and outreach in task 1, staff will develop a guidebook for municipalities interested in planning and implementing curb management strategies. The guidebook will discuss several topic areas, including developing curb management strategies that are consistent with the municipality's larger transportation goals, identifying stakeholders, including transportation equity populations, and developing curb management strategies, establishing metrics to evaluate the success of curb management changes, evaluating how changes to curb management can affect equity populations, developing a plan for monitoring and enforcing compliance with the curb management strategy, considering the broader context of curb space changes, including land use, density, and existing activities of the curb, making changes to curb use quickly and in emergency situations, such as changes made as a result of COVID-19, and finally determining whether and how to keep emergency changes in the long term. The product of task 2 will be a guidebook for the municipalities interested in planning and implementing curb management strategies. And finally, staff will present the guidebook to the MPO board. Happy to take any questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul. Questions from the members? Laura Gilmore.
Hi, Paul. This is great. This is something that I'm very interested in, and I'm glad to see that the MPO is doing it. The one thing that I wanted to bring up is that reading the scope of work, I didn't see much in it that related to deliveries. And, you know, that's one thing that I think, especially in light of COVID, has become increasingly important. You know, that the use of the curb has changed not only for pickup and drop off of people and some of these temporary uses that have been put in place to expand open space and sidewalks in light of social distancing. But there's also been a massive disruption in national and international supply chains and an increase in e-commerce. And so I would just encourage you to also consider that, and you know, where there may be changing needs along the curb for deliveries, both, you know, Amazon and, you know, deliveries for restaurants and the like. Because, you know, if those things aren't accounted for in some way at a curbside, it can gum up the works on the street, or, you know, in bus lanes and bike lanes and facilities that we're hoping to use for other purposes.
Thank you. That's definitely something we can take into consideration, and particularly as we noted, it's sort of a it's been a quickly changing situation with COVID, so we can take that into consideration for that.
Lynn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm asking about how you're planning on doing the outreach to municipalities. I asked because your predecessor, Andrew Clark, when he talked with us about it, mentioned that when he did outreach, he got a limited response, I mean, a very limited response from municipalities. So I was just wondering how you plan on doing that outreach so that you get maybe a wider response. Thank you.
I may defer to some of our outreach specialists here at CTPS for that, but I think you know, hopefully using our network and letting people know about the scope and just, you know, trying to be persistent and reaching out to people and explaining the importance of it.
All right, thanks.
David Kozis?
Yeah, I'm also really happy to see this this phase two, and I'm wondering for this phase, would there maybe be any chance to look at combined uses, such as, you know, deliveries plus parking at different times of day, or, you know, a bike lane plus a bus zone in certain areas? I don't think that that was covered in the last phase.
Yeah, I'm making a note of that. It's certainly something that we can consider as well. I mean, as part of our outreach, we're going to talk to folks about what they're doing, but also potentially, you know, different ideas that they might have in doing that. And certainly, as I said before to Laura, that, you know, there's a lot of things happening and changing right now with COVID, and so there's a lot of new and interesting ideas out there that we'd like to address and see what folks are doing.
Great, thank you, Paul.
Jim Fitzgerald?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just wanted to kind of second what David and Leonard and Laura were saying. Just looking forward to really the continuation of this important work, and specifically, you know, kind of the uptick in kind of last mile deliveries. We've got a couple potential sort of new desires for Amazon to locate some more of those in the city. So that's a really important issue that Laura brings up as well. So, and just, you know, just wanted to again offer kind of the coordination with my colleagues at BTD Planning that are really doing some kind of interesting and new work in this area for the city. So I think we'll be happy to work with you guys as needed. So thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Jim Monty?
Yeah, hey, Paul, this is great. One thing I think you've probably covered here, I'm just going to say it anyway, you know, governance of how different communities manage their street space. Having gone through the whole bus lane process and watching, you know, our colleagues and other communities go through it, I think one of the big differentiating factors in what was able to be done and on what timeline really came down to how, you know, what the governance structure was in regulating curb space and street space, and it varies quite a bit across the communities. So I think I'm going to assume that that's what you're including in terms of process, but just if not, that's something I think you should take a look at.
Okay, will do, definitely.
Tom O'Brien?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think this is a really important and timely study. I think it'll be very helpful to municipalities to have these tools. A lot of municipalities have already made a lot of adaptations over the past few months, particularly around outdoor dining. And I'm curious if the study will include outdoor dining as part of it, and if there would be any outreach to businesses to get their input.
I think as a subject area, outdoor dining would definitely be a piece of it. I mean, particularly if it's people are using curb space for that now, and we've seen that. It's in terms of outreach to businesses. I don't think that was specifically in the scope, but it's something we could consider adding if you know, the municipalities are working with the businesses and the board feels that we should do that. I think that's something we could potentially do.
Yeah, I think it could be helpful, and maybe some of the municipalities could identify folks who have done unique things and use them as examples.
Okay, definitely.
Excellent. Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, can I get a motion in a second to approve? Laura? No, I'm sorry. Eric?
I make a motion to approve this work scope.
Jay Monty,
I'll second that.
motion having been made and seconded. Jonathan, please call the roll.
David Moeller,
Yes.
John Bouchard,
John Bouchard, yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Samantha Silverberg,
Yes.
Laura Gilmore,
Yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Brian Kane,
Kane, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Tom Kadzis,
Yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
David Kozis,
David Kozis, yes.
Sheila Page,
Yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bennett, yes.
Thatcher Keyser,
Patrick Keyser votes yes.
Darlene Wynn,
Darlene Wynn, yes.
Jennifer Constable,
Jennifer Constable, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Yes.
Motion carries unanimously, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Jonathan. Next item on the agenda is member items. Do any members have any items they'd like to bring before the MPO at this time? Lynn?
Yes, and I'm sorry that I failed to mention that along with my reelection is the reelection of the current vice chair, Scott Sudeikis, who I very much consider a co-chair instead of a vice chair. He's been very helpful. So just need to mention that. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Sheila Page?
Thank you. Yeah, it's with regret I wanted to let you all know that I think this is my last meeting as an MPO member. Lexington decided not to run. It was a difficult decision. We were trying to balance our interest in the regional transportation, our own TIP project, and staff workload as we're turning to a few transportation initiatives in our town. So I just wanted to thank you all, and in particular, thank the MPO staff. They've been wonderfully helpful to me trying to understand this whole process, which is really interesting and very important. And so to all of you, I appreciate all your work in forwarding our region's better transportation network. So thank you. And I will be around probably at all the meetings. So I look forward to seeing you all, hopefully in person and sometime soon. So thank you.
Thank you, Sheila. We'll miss having you on the board, but I'm glad you'll be staying around.
Oh yeah.
Other items? Jonathan, when's the next meeting?
November 5th.
Next meeting is November 5th.
Thank you. Mark your calendars. Can I get a motion and a second from a member to adjourn? And please state your name for the record. Samantha Silverberg.
Samantha Silverberg makes a motion to adjourn the Boston Region MPO meeting.
Eric Barassa.
I second that.
Without objection, I see no objections. We are adjourned. Thank you all very much. See you in 2 weeks. Bye, guys.